want to kick it off by saying thank you for everyone that's participated in the conference so far. It's been absolutely amazing just to watch all the discussions and the panelists provide their expertise and feedback to the community. I think what's even more exciting to me is all the conversations that are happening in the sidebars and the discussions that are so lively with tons of different perspectives and experience. And so I'm very, very excited to wrap up the week with this discussion and with the set of panelists that we have on today. And so I think just again, a big shout out and thank you to everyone that's a part of this community of sales comp experts. With that, I'd love to dive right into our discussion today, really kind of thinking about what's coming next for sales compensation. And when I think about, going back to when I entered my career in the world of sales compensation and sales strategy, territory, quota setting, et cetera, the way that we operated, the frequency of change was drastically less than it is today. In fact, at that time, I remember organizations, the biggest pain points were really just the focus on how do we become compliant on such a large part of our cost center and the cost of executing on comp. And it's clear now that sales comp is taking a bigger seat at the table when it comes to strategy. It's clearly a very important lever that needs to evolve as fast as business strategy. And so, very excited to dig in with our panelists today and get a sense of what's to come. So with that, I'm going to shift over and open up to introductions. I'll pass it over to Rick to kick us off with the first intro.
Well, thanks, Nabil. My name is Rick Butler. I am the Vice President of Global Sales Compensation for ServiceNow. ServiceNow is a cloud-based software company. I've been with them for about 4 years, and prior to that, I ran the comp programs at Dell, EMC, and Lucent. So I've been doing sales compensation since about 2002.
Amazing. Thank you for joining, Rick, and I'll pass it over to Robert here.
Thank you, Nabil. Robert Bishar, is one of my hobbies is all worldwide sales incentive comp at Autodesk. So that includes everything from design through implementation, through operation, and also the partner comp side of the house, aside from a few other hobbies. Similar to Rick, I'm a few years behind him. I started in 2006 on this journey, so been in this for a while and looking forward to this discussion.
Amazing. Thank you, Robert. And last but not least, Dell.
Thanks, Nabil. Dal Sidhu here. I'm the head of global sales compensation at Zoom. Been at Zoom for about 3 years now. Prior to Zoom, I was at SAP, spent a majority of my career there. I live in Vancouver, British Columbia, Canada. I've been in the tech industry for almost 25 years. Mostly focused around sales compensation and sales operations.
Awesome. Perfect. So yeah, I think just to jump right in, as I mentioned, what's 100% consistent across the world of sales comp that we see on a day-to-day basis is the speed the world is evolving. Strategy evolves faster and faster every day. Incentives and an alignment of strategy needs to evolve. And so, just to kind of kick us off here with, at a high level, what you're all seeing in your day-to-day in terms of the direction that sales comp is going, trends and insights that you'd like to share. It's, maybe kick it off back to you, Rick.
So what I'm noticing here, and this is within probably the last 12 months, there is an increasing focus on the granularity of metrics and trying to get as specific as possible with, in our case, on the software side of the house, how things are being used, how they're being consumed, right? And it's posing some challenges for us, not just from a sales compensation perspective, but even at the product level. When we think about trying to get to certain levels of granularity, the product has to have already thought out a way to provide the telemetry that you might need in order to do the, again, clicking and counting of all of the things that are going on when you want to maybe compensate on it. So I would say, we always talk about going from macro to micro. I think that's where we're really at with sales compensation. And I don't know how fast it's going to be across all industries, but certainly on the software side, it's moving really fast.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think it's a very good way to summarize kind of like the and it's such broad context to how that applies, because it changes what you know. As soon as you change what you measure, you change effectively the entirety of the mechanics of comp. But Robert, I don't know if that resonates or.
Absolutely. So that actually ties into a lot of what we're seeing changing fundamentally. So number one is, I'll say the number of metrics being looked at. That doesn't mean we're going to go to multiple metrics. God, no. You want to keep it as simple as possible, of course. So our old rules as to how many metrics is actually healthy versus when does it really get unhealthy, that's unchanged. But there's sort of two fundamental shifts that we're seeing. Number one is more specialized plans based on the sales cycle and duration, so that you actually have different time period durations for different roles that are focused on certain things. So classic old school, everything's a year. Now we see some are a quarter, some are a year, depending on the length of the sales cycle, and far more specialized than they ever were before. And in addition, the introduction of a lot of activity-based metrics to be included in comp that in the past were a little frowned upon, because it's like you sold and then you were done. Now it's more, well, when you sold, that's just the beginning of the journey. So what's next, and what are the components that play into there? So with what Rick just said and these components, we're seeing some fundamental changes in the industry overall, and also talking to colleagues and getting sort of their sort of viewpoint, getting similar feedback.
Absolutely. And Dal, how do you see?
Yeah, very similar to what Rick and Robert have said. Usage, consumption, adoption are all trends that we're, or even in the industry that I'm seeing a lot of. Customer retention is also another big one, right? And how do you kind of balance between incremental selling and retaining the customer, especially when you talk about net new logos. And I've seen organizations trying to create teams specifically focused on net new logos, but then that sales cycle is very, very long, right? And I say it's one of the hardest jobs to do in any company, is to acquire net new logos versus trying to culture and drive more revenue up with an existing customer and retaining that customer. So there's a lot of these things that are trying to get balanced out. And an individual sales rep only has so many hours in a day. So it's like, hey, where do we want to put the majority of their compensation and their time? Like, all these things are starting to become more and more important in the industry, and not only just in tech, but across almost every industry that I can think of.
Yeah, I think it has an implication too for role design, right? Because as you start to get more granular metrics, like Robert said, or even the point that Dal brought up, right? The old way of selling, or the old sales job, if you will, now has a lot more facets to it. And that, of course, then opens up the door for how time gets allocated, how time gets used, the way you're going to measure and pay people, right? But at the end of the day, I think all three of us would probably agree that the focus is on results generation, and whether that results is a sales result or a satisfied customer, I think that's the key.
Absolutely. And to your point, with the shift, the whole world is going towards a form of subscription, be it purely consumption based, be it pay upfront and things like that. But sort of the more and more it gets away from the old school perpetual sell once and then just, you have the revolving maintenance add-on. The more it goes in that direction of subscription, the more it goes in the direction of platform, which then is still a subscription on top of the platform, the more you have to think about the longevity and, to Dal's point, the retention, because it's not just a simple renewal of maintenance, which is like, it's kind of an insurance, whereas it's a resell, which starts earlier in the cycle than with maintenance. And I think a lot of people underestimate, or still sort of have the old school, a renewal is much easier than selling new. Yes, to Dal's point, if I'm hunting a new logo, that is absolutely complicated, and you pay for that accordingly. However, new on top of renewal, yes, it's difficult, but different again. So I think we're reevaluating, when does the process start and how complicated is it? And to Rick, redesigning roles accordingly, which is different from what we used to have.
And I think the other challenge around that is like the type of resources, the number of resources you need, depending on the type of accounts you got. 'Cause everybody wants to go to the top end accounts and have the most resources on top end accounts, but then every customer is considered just as equally important, right? So then you get into this fight around, well, how many resources do we need? And then there's we've got the sales reps, we have the renewal team, we have the customer success organization, you've got the technical account managers, right? You could have specialists. All that ends up being a cost. And if everybody's being paid on that same dollar, because number one, you could be just retaining or do an upsell, like that starts to become very costly model, right? So paying on, again, these are challenges, right? Like paying on that same dollar multiple times, even though it's harder to retain that dollar, it becomes a financial challenge within any organization. And so trying to create a proper balance amongst those things is where I see, when you talk about the future of compensation, that's that complexity, that excitement, as well as, well, how can I create more of a balance where you still need to focus on growth, right? Because every company, when you look at, if you're a public company, right, or even want to become a public company, everybody looks at your growth and your margins, and that's what really dictates your share price, and trying to balance that with the resources that you have, that becomes very difficult, because you've got a microscope on those two very key metrics as you're trying to bring shareholder value. So it's a difficult task, but it's one that probably needs better technology, better tools, better data points to kind of help build that out, and then start looking at, well, maybe you can't focus on every single customer. Maybe there's like, hey, you need to kind of look at the 80-20, right? Mm-hmm. And if bringing you 80% of your revenue, that's probably where you're going to spend most of your resources, and try to build more of a self-service model for everything else, right? So there's a lot of puts and takes that has to go into this, and technology starts to become more and more important around self-service and all that kind of stuff that has to happen with your customers, especially if those customers really, really like your product, right? Because you really start off with the small business, medium businesses, and you kind of grow up in the enterprise. Nobody goes to the enterprise right away, right? So and then it's like, hey, that's my bread and butter. I need to maintain those customers as well. So
yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting, because if you think about it, in the last 4 years, the swings that have happened in, I mean, again, it's like we've all felt it in different ways across different industries, but that push from all of a sudden not unknown to growth at all costs to back to kind of complete focus on margin, and the push to think about kind of how do we react faster. It goes kind of back to activities, or thinking beyond the original sale, to summarize kind of like the points that are being made here. I guess if we dive into that specifically, and you think about the trends that are, or the direction that we're going to take with sales comp when it comes to activity-based incentives or consumption/usage tied incentives, how do you see that changing the way that you're setting up and thinking about comp today?
I'll jump right in. Consumption and usage is a key metric for some of our sellers. If it wouldn't be, it would be an unsuccessful execution of the contracts we have. A key component is the day after you close the sale, you actually need to make sure that renewal 3 years down the road actually happens, which means you need to focus, again, comes back to Dal's point, not a hunter, it's an existing account. You're managing the account, you're managing the expansion, which means you need to, number one, ensure that they actually consume what they already purchased and use it. Number two, the expansion goes from there. You widen, you broaden, more of the same users, more of new technology being brought in that then can be consumed. So there's definitely a shift away from the old sell and run which has been a shift for years. It's just been very difficult to implement because, to Rick's point, the telemetry of products didn't necessarily support what we wanted to accomplish. And I think there's a shift happening now where the product teams are starting to realize, hey, I need these metrics because I want my product to be sticky, or I want my product to be used. So therefore, I have to be able to see that. And that then automatically can be used as part of a comp for a sales team. And when I say sales team, it comes back to what was said previously. A sales team or an account team consists of not just the salesperson themselves. It's everything from the pre-sales, sales development rep, all the way through to the CSM, who can all be on variable comp plans if you think about it. It's just what metrics do you use, what's the pay mixes, and so what's the plans you put in place for them. So the landscape is definitely growing for variable incentive comp.
So with that landscape growing, and I think that points very valid around, the tying to these different outcomes, the different parts of the sales process to incentives. Is that enough? Is it changing the way that the sales compensation teams that own the design of plans and the ongoing administration interact with the rest of the organization? I feel like it naturally has to, because you have to understand the black box that is the sales process today.
You actually have to broaden your horizon significantly, where in the past you may have just focused on sales. You now have to understand the end-to-end process in the customer life cycle. So you actually have to understand the whole go-to-market process itself, or the strategy behind it, to be able to come up with the comp plans for all the impacted roles. And also, it's a significant change for a lot of people, moving from formerly, just, I'll call it, corporate bonus incentive plans, sort of yearly, annually, and now all of a sudden you're moving to something where I'm paid monthly on my success on ensuring something is consumed. So it's not just a sale, it's a lot more.
I found that the activity-based plans, right, and I've used those in all of my companies, right, work well if you're able to tie the activity to a specific result or outcome. Many times, though, people gravitate towards paying for just rewarding the completion of an activity without asking the so what question, right? I get a lot of pressure from my CFO on all of the plans that have any element of either a key sales objective, a KSO, or an MBO in it, because they feel like those are gimmies, right? In other words, people are automatically going to get 100% achievement, so why even bother, doing it? We've spent a lot of time making sure that, to the point that Robert made as it relates to the go-to-market, that when we look at individual activities where we have them, that they fit into that overall sales process and they lead to the completion of what would be the next step or the result, right? So it's really key to make sure that in an activity-based plan, that it's not just about doing X, it's about seeing the result that comes from it.
Yeah. Activity-based plans are not do your job plans, they are outcome-based.
Right.
Don't ever put I did my training so I get paid plan into place.
100%. And with the plethora of data that we're now collecting, I mean, Zoom has obviously changed, kind of the way that we run our sales organization in terms of the amount of data we're collecting on a call-by-call basis. So it's just adds even more to that, the measurement of conversion that, or measurement of ROI to those activity-based incentives.
Absolutely. I mean, if you think about it, and I'm sure we've all heard about it, right? Land, adopt, renew, expand, right? And if you kind of look at all those different areas, you've got different players in each, right? And like you guys have mentioned, there's different activities that go on with that. And some of those activities don't necessarily result in revenue, but it does result in, an expansion occurring, a renewal occurring, right? An adoption occurring. And, everybody says, compensation drives behavior. Right? We all heard that same saying, right? So all these things, kind of like as Robert mentioned, like looking from the whole end to end, and as a compensation expert, a compensation specialist, that job is getting a little bit more complicated, is getting a little bit more I would say broader, right? And everybody thinks about like when you talk about career development and everything else, is like, hey, there's like so much more that can be done within compensation, and to think about it across the land, adopt, expand, renew, expand, whichever way you want to look at it, right? And all the things that kind of sew each one of those things together. It's a complex world that we're starting to move into. And there's many activities that are easy to measure. We can say, hey, we can build compensation around it. But then the ones that are most important, like I think Robert or Rick had mentioned that, engineers, when they first started developing product, they really didn't talk about, how do we measure adoption? Do they really care? Because all they really thought about was, here's the pricing metric, right? Mm-hmm. Go out and sell it. And now we're trying to go backwards and say, well, wait a minute. Yeah, we've got the pricing out there. We sold this, but how do we even know if the customer's using, right? Because now we're getting a bunch of churn. So, backtracking and trying to now tell the engineering organization to say, you need to build some, telepathy into your product, that when we start to look at it and say, is this a successful product or not, right? Not even for the engineering organization, but even from a selling standpoint, an adoption standpoint, a renewal standpoint, because all those things matter, right? So now we're even going beyond just from a business development standpoint to when the product is even built and we're trying to bring it to market, to make sure they're thinking about these kind of things.
What I've noticed in my career, the exceptional salespeople, right? And these aren't just the people that are consistently meeting their goals, but the exceptional salespeople have always thought across all of these steps when they make a sale and after the sale and when they're planning for the next sale, right? And I've noticed most of them, are so tight with the relationships with their customers that they plug in and help either the adoption step or the renewal step or all of those things automatically, right? Those are the salespeople, the cream of the crop, if you will, that have really had this kind of full view of the customer and making them successful really at the top of the heap there, right? And you can see it when you look at how the results are generated, right? You can see the person that's simply just closing out and getting the quotas closed, right? But you can really tell those that have that differentiation by how they approach the job.
To your point, Rick, those are the people that make it to club every year versus the ones who sporadically make it. Absolutely.
That's right.
They're also the ones you don't need to help. And I'll say this rudely for us as comp people, their comp plan, they just want to make the money, but they will work the same way every time. It's the rest where you truly have to drive the behavior pattern. They'll protest if they're not paid correctly, no doubt, but they're a little less worrisome. It's sort of when you think of the distribution curve of attainment, it's that middle that you truly have to focus on to get them behaving in the right way and moving in the right direction, because every point you can shift to the right is a substantial revenue increase. Mm-hmm.
So as we think about the surface area of what our incentives are driving, right? Can have broader go-to-market, when you think about the broader go-to-market incorporated into this, as back to what you said earlier, Rick, the granularity of the measurements and everything we've been talking about in terms of what you're actually paying on, as that increases, then, and I'm just looking at the kind of the chat here that's public and talking about multipliers for renewals, et cetera. All of these things, the more granular you go, the more potential negative outcomes could happen if you overemphasize one metric versus another. And so I'm curious what you think it's like, what's the impact on us going more granular to the timing of how we look at results and data and present dashboards to senior leadership? Like how is it changing our reporting of success of sales comp that we're going more granular and we're shifting this way?
Sorry.
Go ahead, Dale.
Yeah, with those metrics and with the granularity, what everybody wants to look at is like, what's actionable, right? Instead of telling a story, tell me where I need to focus. And when you start looking at the all the different type of metrics that we have and the details as far as you want to go down, graphs are pretty, but it doesn't get you to what the executives want. It's like, where's the problem and what do I have to do to solve it? And that's one of the things that when you start building out these metrics and you start looking at, what is it that we really want to put into it from a comp perspective, that's the one thing that I would recommend is like, it has to solve a problem, right? It's not just a nice to have. There has to be a reason why we want this in there, because it's driving a different type of behavior. And it's going to have a net positive impact to a customer and a net positive impact to the organization.
And to add to that, number one, it has to be a metric that actually impacts something. And at the same time, it's also the person that's on the variable plan has to be able to impact that metric. So
Absolutely.
The further detached you are from the result or the size of the metric, the less you're going to focus on it and the less you're going to care. The closer you are, that's where truly going into the micro versus macro has a big impact. So it's at the personal level and at the sort of company result level from it.
Rick, anything to add there in terms of?
No, I think I was listening to both Dal and Robert. They picked up on the points that I'm very sensitive to. And when I think again from the seller's perspective, using that surface area type discussion, right? People, again, the excellent or exceptional sellers will try to cover as much of that surface area themselves, right? In getting the job done, right? Which is good, but that's not for everybody. We need experts that focus on certain sections of that particular surface area, right? Whether they focus on renewals, whether they focus on adoption, or whatever the case is. So I think we're always going to see a blend of roles that, are specialists in that respect, and then those that are more generalists, right? And it's making sure that you're choreographing them all together so you don't have a whole lot of unintended overlap, because I hate overlap and having to pay the same thing to multiple people.
Yeah. And too many cooks in the kitchen. At the end of the day, nobody's responsible or accountable for the results overall. So yeah, try to keep overlap at a minimum. There is always a certain amount of overlap because you do want to have a clean handoff. To before, what all of us have said is you got to look at the end-to-end cycle, and there has to be a clean handoff between them. But if everybody's sort of piled on top of one another from a comp perspective, nobody's accountable.
Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah,
because we all do this.
So I guess that feeds into the next, next concept we had discussed kind of in terms of trends, the individualization of comp plans, or more specifically, maybe the oh wow, I'm not able to get it now. Proliferation of plans that we've seen, right? And so, as we talked about, the more roles, the more specialized that we become, naturally, the more set of plans, the more individualized. And maybe to define it best, I don't know, Robert, you had, in our last discussion with you and Rick, we kind of touched on this. I think it's a very important concept. So I'll pass over to you just to kind of lay out the definition on this one.
I'll try to recap what I said. Sometimes I forget. For me, the most important part is individualization of comp plans does not mean by individual. It more or less means by the group of tasks that you're supposed to be doing. And so the individualization is associated with the results you're supposed to achieve. And that, for me, is the requirement of individualization of comp plans. It's not, a free-for-all and each individual gets their own plan. That would drive our work through the roof and would drive me personally crazy. Because then there's no consistency, and then you've basically counterbalanced the individual's desire to achieve something with nobody can compare one another. Because never forget, salespeople, just focusing on them for a second, they're very competitive. And so if you can show seller A better seller B, that's something, not necessarily showing money and all those things, but it is a competitive landscape. And so the individualization, sorry, difficult word this morning, still requires a comparability amongst same roles. So it's not an individual by individual, it's an individual more by role or by category.
Yeah, I agree with that, because as you start thinking about I think we're all having a problem with it. Individualization, right? And you start thinking across different markets, right? Different segments. Even though you might be paying on, let's say, a similar metric, there's probably certain nuances with somewhere, in a different in a different segment, where you're gonna have to tweak it for that population, not for that individual, but for that population. You're gonna have to tweak it a little bit. You might be thinking about, reducing your accelerators because the quota is a little bit lower, or you might be looking at your overall TI change, right? Like, I think there's a lot of things that when you talk about that individualization, you're really kind of looking at the group of people that are focusing on those particular areas and creating consistency or similarities within a plan that focus in that particular segment, right? Or that particular group. So yeah, it's not about, hey, let's make sure that everybody has their own individual territories and individual comp plans and giving everybody, like, you choose your own adventure, right? That's really not the direction we want to go, but really around how can we create the right sort of grouping of plans or plan types for that particular group, and be able to kind of leverage similarities within that and drive the right results overall, right? And I think Robert had mentioned around comparability, right? You want to be able to compare people within that group against their peers and how they're doing, because you want to be able to measure success, and be able to reward that proper success as well.
So this is a great topic, and we're unfortunately, I think, avoiding the elephant on the table for part of it, but that's okay. I'll give you a perspective here on this topic of individualization. We're starting to think in terms of personas, and the persona alignment that we're starting to think in terms of is who in the customer organization is a group of sellers selling to, right? Are they selling to a CIO in the COO organization? Are they selling to a supply chain organization? Are they selling to a marketing or business development organization? And the persona aspect of it, when it's played back in that scenario, then ties back to both what Dal and Robert said, right? Because now it says, what are the metrics that we need to compare everybody on? But then what, based upon selling to that particular type of client versus another client, requires some individualization or customization, right? And it's trying to find that right blend of what makes it truly unique for the role, but then what's common for everybody. Almost like if you use benefits and the choice of benefits as an example, right? Having customized benefits doesn't mean everybody picks and chooses everything. Everybody has the same fundamental or foundational base, and then some of the other things might be nuanced to them. It's the same type of approach. Yeah.
Yep, absolutely. Could not agree more. You always have a horizontal sort of commonality across, and then there's role specific, to your point, persona specific, which then again is also segment specific, what you need to drive and accomplish.
Yeah. I mean, yeah. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
And we're in the sales cycle, of course.
Yeah.
I like that benefits approach that you're looking, because that's what we've done in some of our plans. Like, hey, if you got more of a team approach, there's certain bonuses you just don't get. If you're more individualized in terms of you have a direct link to the customer, you're going to have more benefits, right? So like, we've actually done that, and I think it's worked out well. And getting the leaders to understand, hey, we can afford this because we have a direct linkage. We can't afford that because more of a socialized program.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's an element of like the moment that because you could argue that the moment that the number of personas, the level of customer segments you go after, the product specialization, you factor all this in, which part of the sales process, you eventually could get to a world where every rep has a unique comp plan. But I want to premise this with, let's think about quota setting, right? And I'm curious what everyone's perspective is. So with quota setting, you could, in theory, depending on your quota setting methodology, have unique quotas by rep. But what's key, and I think just to touch on what you talked about very beginning to kick us off, Robert, in the definition, is you wouldn't make exceptions to your quota setting methodology for a single individual, but you could have differently set targets for each individual. And so the concept here is, what we're talking about is tying incentives to specific personas and segments that we're going after. But the longer that this continues, the more that we could have. Like the planned proliferation, like where does it stop? I guess is that the big elephant in the room that you're referring to, Rick?
It is, because, and then I see one popping up in the chat here. How do you address this from a planning and administration side of the house, right? If everybody has their own thing, right, it's just almost impossible to try to manage, which goes back to my original tenet, which was everybody has to carry a certain common thing, and then you customize a portion of it to make it unique to that particular either sale opportunity, whatever the case is, right? I think, part of the other aspect of individualization is also, do we let people pick their own quotas, right? But more importantly, not just picking your own quota, picking your own reward associated with that quota. And again, if the risk is, if everybody did that, you might not cover what the corporate number requirement is. Well, again, everybody has to take a certain amount, and then there's an increment provided on top of it, maybe that allows the individualization. So there's a couple ways to, again, manage both pieces, but also make sure you're covering your bets to make sure you do achieve whatever the corporate number result is. Yeah.
Yeah, basically different pay lines by basically quota band you choose to cover. But to your point, Nabil, I think the path forward and what we're all seeing is you have a certain set of commonalities, then you have a certain set of components that you can pick and choose to customize, to individualize a plan. Those have to be reflected in your ability to set the respective targets. And I explicitly use the word targets versus quotas, because with the prior mentioned, telemetry of products, it could be a monetary, i.e. a quota, but it could also be a consumption component. It could be a value add component. There's a lot of things. Now, what you don't want to do is, SDRs being paid on the number of calls they do, and you don't check the quality, because of course they're always going to blow that number out of the water. So you have to delicately balance between the complexity of your plan and your ability to be able to set the targets accordingly, and also do that make sense. So while from a plan design perspective, we might be a little over eager at times, you're brought back by your ability, what you can actually set targets for.
And just from an administration standpoint, like I wouldn't recommend if you're doing your compensation plans or your administration on like Excel, I wouldn't recommend this at all. Like you need to kind of invest in the right technology in order for this to happen, because without the technology and the automation, it's going to be near impossible.
Yeah.
And I think as we're starting to get, more knowledgeable with AI, right? And I think that's really going to open up a lot of doors around these type of things.
Yeah, I certainly agree. I think technology, and then there's also an element of process. I think, Rick, what you said earlier around, having these all these part components that are tweaked or tailored to that persona, that seller. When you think about kind of designing a process where all of these inputs kind of feed into it and tweak, it's a combination of technology, Dal, and with how you interact and build these workflow mechanisms to manage comp at scale. But yeah. So I think you touched on something that's quite interesting, Rick, and I think the concept of kind of picking your own plan or picking your own quota. At the very beginning of this week, right, we had the two academics that joined us and provided kind of some of their insights. And I think the concept of, the buy-in, the having an end sales professional pick and take responsibility for their choice can go a long way, right? From a behavioral economics perspective. There comes a lot of complexities and risks and other attributes. And so, I'm just thinking, as we think about this generational shift that's going to happen, right? Where the way I would describe it is those that grew up with computers versus those that grew up like adopting computers. And I remember, I started with pen and paper, and in my, in my schooling, I shifted over to computers, and that was a kind of a very big shift. But as we see this new generation of sales professionals that grew up in a world of technology where UX experience is paramount, and that feeling of autonomy, how do we think about giving them that choice despite the complexities that come along with it? I'm curious, across the board, how, and maybe I know you shared it, Rick, so I'll pass it over to you, and then I would love to get Dal and Robert your perspective on it.
So it plays to the psychology behind again, motivating individuals, right? And you tie your plan performance to it as well. So think of it like this. If you got to a space where it was a pick your own quota environment, right? And pick your own reward. Behind the scenes, obviously, those of us that do the planning activity and the territory alignment, all of those things, we have a really good feel for what the potential is in those territories, either by history or by virtue of maybe addressable market. So we have a good gauge in terms of what we would set the quota at if we were just doing a regular quota setting process. So now here's where the psychology comes in, right? If somebody picks their own quota and they intentionally pick a low ball quota and they run past it, frankly, that's worth less to me than somebody that picks an exceptionally hard quota and gets close to it, right? And I would reward that person more than I would reward the person that picks the softball quota and runs way past it, right? Now, dialing that in from a compensation design perspective is not an easy task, right? Because I think from a planning perspective, you actually have to have more knowledge and insight about the territory than you would when you're just allocating the number from top down and trying to make sure it's covered, right? But that's the real key, because you want those people that are going to take the big challenge and get close to it. Those are the ones you want, because you're actually going to get more results from them than somebody that picks the low ball and runs past it.
Yeah, and the only delicacy there is if you start going down the path, I'm not saying don't, you have to start thinking about, okay, my cost of sales, so I'm going to have to vary pay mixes based on what I had in the past. And in addition, I'm going to have to start thinking about, okay, if this is what I expect from this territory, and you're saying, I'm going to do half of that, then what does that mean in your overall payout? And to your point, if you start defining different pay lines by respective quota that a person will achieve. Not impossible, but still need to make sure that the company stays afloat, of course.
I mean, let's be honest, nothing is free, right? So when you're building the quotas, when you're building the comp plan, you know what the OTE is, right? That all factors into this.
Yep.
And when you start looking at it and saying, oh, okay, well, I've got an individual who's going to take a really high quota, well, your cost of sales is going to be lower. If you think about it, right? Because that person's their quota is gonna be maybe 2-3 times their OTE, right? Your average cost on that deal is gonna be much lower. Somebody takes a lower quota, yeah, the cost is gonna be probably higher, but their acceleration is gonna be much lower, right? And hopefully, the individuals that are taking that lower quota are in a market where you got more volume, right? So you don't want your enterprise rep to give them the option to take a low quota, right? I think you want to put in like certain bands and saying, okay, this band, like we talked about earlier in individualization, your enterprise reps are probably going to have a choice of 3 very, relatively high numbers versus somebody in small business, right? And that's where you're kind of giving that choice. But again, everything comes to a cost. Everything's going to be, managed from a P&L perspective, and what is going to end from a per dollar, deals per dollar standpoint.
As the salespeople will say, your most important negotiation of the whole year is your quota.
Yeah, that's right.
That's right. Yep.
So this goes back to the, the premise of building the infrastructure to have that ability to customize, right? Because now you're going from one pay curve to multiple pay curves, depending on the bands that individual chooses. I imagine it adds further complexity on how you financially model and budget, because now you can't do it at the high level. You need to budget down to the rep choices and quota, and so creates all these other complexities that need to be addressed from an operational side. But just to dive into this one a bit more, so you pick a comp plan. Do you think there's value in offering the reps the ability to pivot from their choice at a certain point in the year?
Oh, no, it would be like changing the rules after the game's played. You roll the dice at the beginning and that's what you get. That's it, right? Which puts the onus on the seller now to have a little bit more insight in terms of what they think they can deliver against what the potential is. Yeah. But once you pick it, you're locked in.
I totally agree with Rick. Like they have to take and educate. They have to be part of the process, right? And giving them that choice means that they're part of the process, and they should be evaluating and saying, well, what can I really achieve from this territory? Now, if the territory completely changes, right, the manager rips out 30 accounts and gives them brand new 30 accounts, of course you have to look at that, right? But if you got your accounts in your territory and you've been cultivating for the last year and there's a bunch of deals to pop, you might want to go for the higher accelerator deal, right? Or sorry, the plan. But yeah, you have to put a majority of that onus back on the sales organization. Like they have to have the skin in the game, and they have to make the choice for themselves.
Yeah, there's consequences to the decision, and I think people will go through a learning process. It is a fundamentally different way of thinking about it. And for most of us, that's a big cultural shift. Mm-hmm. Some will appreciate it. The ones we mentioned before, the ones who always perform well, you pretty much can predict where they're going to go. Once they figure out the financials, they're going to lean to the higher quota. It's sort of the middle ground that will try to play the safe. Let's do lower. And then you can already think about the discussions you're going to have, because they'll want to change. Oh, I came in way better than I thought. I'm going to want to change my plan now. And you say no. A first word that's going to come out of their mouth is, that's not fair.
Yeah.
I mean, I've heard that. And this is one where you then have to say, okay, depending on the length of your cycle. So say if you're quarterly, okay, that makes it a lot easier, because then people will learn fairly quick and they'll adapt quicker to, okay, now you don't want to offer a free for all. You want to give them certain quota bands that you can choose from, for example. But if it's annual and they pick the wrong one, you've got a great risk of retention, because it's like, I'm not going to make any money. I'm out of here. So that's where you got to be really careful.
Yeah, actually, I think that ties it out so well to, like, the faster that the business strategy is changing, the faster that incentives need to change. In terms of our incentive strategy, and then the faster that you need to be able to pivot that incentive strategy itself, because you need to be able to have faster cycles. I mean, it almost where possible, where you can, shifting to smaller cycles, whether it's half a year cycles or quarterly, actually drives the ability for you to A/B test, roll out different incentives and incentive strategies, et cetera. There's a ton of great questions, so I do want to maybe shift over to Q&A here. I think one of the ones that kind of just looking at here that aligns very much with the previous topic around activity-based incentives. So around the only activity-based metric that we have dabbled with is pipeline creation, and that has not gone so well. So I'd like to understand how you determine the integrity of activity-based metrics. This is a big one, right? Going back to the data piece.
Like we talked about earlier, right? Like pipeline creation to me is table stakes. If you're not creating pipeline, like what are you there for, right? You're not going to hit your quota unless you build your pipeline. So like for me, like that type of activity is not something I would compensate on.
Agreed.
Right? When we talk about like an adoption metric, like that's something that's like, hey, wait a minute, this is actually going to add value. We know that's going to create that stickiness. That's something we probably want to do, right? Or if there is a specific product, right, that you want to focus on, you kind of drive that particular product sale. That to me is more the activity based versus saying, wow, like we talked about earlier, how many phone calls have you made? What's your pipeline build? Like that to me is not something I would put in the comp plan.
Yeah, I would never put pipeline as a compensatable item. I might consider putting either velocity or close rate as one of the metrics, but never building the pipeline.
So I'm going to be the oddball here. For certain roles, more like sales development, who are trying to and supposed to generate a pipeline for the respective salespeople they support, it is something you can think about as long as you tie it to conversion. So to the point made, pipeline alone, no, that's your job. Pipeline tied to conversion. Now we have sort of a metric that is part of your job and a qualitative sort of identifier or sort of component within it that shows, is the pipeline you created actually worth something? At the same time, you learn how much pipeline do you actually need and what's the conversion rate overall to make sure that it actually matches. So while I said I'm the oddball out, I would do that, but not just on its own. But to the earlier point, or what both mentioned, the adoption and consumption, definitely.
And just to double click on that, because I think having you had a similar conversation with almost each of you in the past, I think you're actually all far closer aligned than. And I want to dig into this because I think this is an important piece. The reason why Dal, Rick, you both have visceral reaction of no, we would not pay on pipeline. Can I make just clarify maybe what I assume why you have such a visceral reaction, which is that the compliance of what pipeline dollars look like is not strictly enforced, and therefore $1 of pipeline by rep A is very different than $1 of pipeline by rep B, and actually gives us a metric that's very difficult to track. Is my assumption there correct in terms of why you?
I would look at it from point of view like the quality of the pipeline. Like if a sales rep is being paid on the pipeline, they can progress the pipeline. And then at stage, whatever the stage, at a high stage, it's like, oh, it's lost, right? Like, when we talk about conversion, like that's, kind of bringing the two pieces together, whereas like you got the pipeline and you have your conversion rate, bringing those two pieces together makes more sense. Just paying on volume of pipe, to me, it's garbage.
Yeah, I agree.
You can put anything in there you want. So to your point, unless you have an extreme hygiene, and even if you do have that, the risk level is through the roof.
And not every dollar of pipeline is the same, right? Some will sit where it starts, some will progress, some will actually increase in size, and some will decrease in size. So it's just too easy to game.
Right, which is why the conversion tie back is so important.
Yep.
Then you can determine, do you actually create a valuable pipeline? Which is kind of what we want to measure the role on.
And then, okay, so I think that is spot on and ties to actually, I think, broadly any sort of activity that you want to measure and track. It has to, again, tie back to the point that you all mentioned in different words, is results need to tie to that activity. So just taking a look at some of the questions here that are coming out. So activity-based metrics sound interesting, but how do you administer with scale and integrity? I think this is more on the kind of operational side of it. So it's not, okay, you pick now you pick the right metric, you can scope it out, you measure, you have compliance on it. How do you actually scale with integrity in terms of?
Don't choose metrics you can't automate. Otherwise, it may be for an exception, for something specific for a short time, but don't choose something you can't measure and can't automate.
Automated, I would add in auditable. Right?
Yeah.
You need to be able to audit it and figure out where it's coming from.
And on the activity-based front, in order to accomplish what both Robert and Dal have said, we actually created what we call an MBO library, which is the approved set of things that they could select from, because we know we can both audit and automate the results posted against them. Yeah.
And just as sort of, I'll call it good practice, don't introduce a comp metric just because you just thought about it and thought it was the great thing or the best since sliced bread. Test it as a KPI, as some people say, keep your job KPI, but not as a comp metric. so that you can determine, number one, can I automate it? Number two, am I going to survive an audit on it, so that you don't by mistake put something in place for which you cannot set targets or you cannot audit, even though you can automate it.
Yeah, I absolutely love that. And I think, we've talked about this. I think it came up in one of our sessions, the last conference, Rick and Robert, around for each comp plan, thinking about the KPIs that you're tracking and measuring to. And it kind of ties into like, they don't even have to be public KPIs, so you could just keep them for yourself to see how the reps are tracking on it. And yeah, measure and track the compliance. Do you want to recognize that we're kind of coming up to time here? I think that just diving in here, is there any last words that you want to share or with the audience here before we wrap up? Rick?
I'm actually surprised that we made it through an hour conversation and the topic of AI did not come up.
I brought it up once.
Yes, you did.
Yeah. This is the holy grail or black hole. I haven't figured out yet which one it's going to be. We're leveraging it, of course, in assisting our response to our sellers when they have inquiries, so that my team can be more efficient in terms of how we respond. That seems to be starting to get some traction and catch on, right? But I haven't walked on the dark side yet and let it help me with plan design or any of those other things yet.
Yeah,
I knew you would have already done that, Robert.
No, we use that just for the simple reason, it's like, what's the prediction? As we all start the journey from the old school ICM, i.e. incentive comp management, to sales performance management, true sales performance, AI is a fundamental foundation to it. You need to be able to model, you need to be able to predict, you need to be able to come with analysis that in the past just weren't possible.
Yeah, I think there's like even the smallest areas like forecasting comp spend. If you optimize forecasting of comp spend, you can unlock money that you can put towards spiffs, other incentives that you would not have normally been able to do so. But there was a comment that came up in the chat around like individualized comp. How would you scale that? How would we administer? And I think the future 5 years plus is in my mind, if we're bogged down with the administration of comp and we're not leveraging AI to support there, then the scalability, the rest of the business is going to keep on moving.
Yep.
And I think that the element of like, right now we're in this very interesting inflection point, right? Where we're going from focused on admin to getting to payroll to compliance to sales compensation being a massive lever for strategy. And to continue that trend, we have to almost leave administration completely behind and automate that in its almost entirety. But
it has to go hand in hand.
100%. Well, I just want to thank. I know we're at time here. I just want to thank you all for being on this panel and sharing your wisdom and experience. And I again just want to double down and thank everyone that's joined today. All the amazing conversation and discussions that have happened on the chat here. And please do not hesitate to reach out and be continued part of this community of sales comp professionals and experts. Awesome. Thank you, Rick. Thank you, Dal. Thank you, Robert.
Thank you, Rick.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.